You say hi now.
Hi, Kelly. Hi, Lee. And Scott, Scott, have you met Del Rey before, right?
Yes. Hi, Scott. Nice to see you again.
Steve Bruno, Steve.
Can you guys hear me? Oh, okay. That was weird. Hi.
We still can't see anything from the boardroom there.
I think they just haven't turned it on.
Now we
There
see
they
you.
are. Cool. Oh, Ray, you should stand up. I can say that joke because, you know. Is Nancy going to be with us in the boardroom? Okay. I suppose I need an agenda. I better pull that up. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, we're visiting Visalia. We just got back from playing disc golf, so I figured it wouldn't affect my ability to listen. It was fun. I'm terrible at it, but that's okay. I knew that. I'm not strong enough. I got a little bit better with the aerodynamics of it, but I'm just not very strong. So it would be like, I'm on 9, and everyone else would be like, oh, that was 3. It was still fun. I don't mind losing. Is Nancy? I'm sorry, I didn't see Nancy. There she is. Hi, Nancy. Okay, go ahead. Let's call the meeting to order at 6:03 p.m. And I was just trying to open the agenda. I'm sorry. I had it open, and then I closed it, and now I'm opening it again. So, 1 second. I believe it's slide split next. Okay. Yes, it is. Call to order at 6:03. Flag salute, if you could stand. Salute. Pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, what? Indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Is that okay? Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
We've lost video. We actually can't see them. It's showing an image of us instead. So we were not able to see.
Oh yeah, that's not
Yes,
good.
that's good. That's going to happen.
So is Scott joining us by Zoom as well?
Mr. Holbrook is in the room, so we're ready to go when you guys are ready to go.
Okay, I just need a motion to adopt the agenda. Someone?
I'll move to adopt
Thank you, Mr. Bruno. And a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Del Rey. General consent?
Yes.
Agenda has been adopted. Item 4, comments from the audience regarding items on the agenda. Do we have any comments from the audience?
We have no audience. Nope. I have nothing.
Hearing none, we can move on to item 5, which is Board Workshop Brown Act update. The board will receive an update and overview of the Brown Act from legal counsel. Here we go. All yours, Scott. Mr. Holbrook. Sorry.
All right. Good evening.
Good evening.
This
Good
is
evening.
a little different than the usual setup, but a lot of things are different recently. Anyway, my name is Scott Holbrook. I'm a partner with Atkinson Annelson Lawyer Root and Romo. I've been involved in education law now for 18 years as a school attorney, working predominantly with school districts, county offices of education, and community college districts. Prior to that, I worked as a counselor and teacher in public and private schools for 12 years. So dealing with education application for quite some time. It's interesting and fun and challenging at the same time. So tonight we're going to be going over the Brown Act. I like to be interactive as possible. So if there are any questions that come up during my presentation, please feel free to interject and ask, and I will try to answer the questions as best as I can. So I'm going to move on. My clicker, I'm out of distance for the clicker, so if I can just ask someone to help me with clicking the slides. Thank you. These are the topics that I'm going to cover. We're going to talk about the intent of the Brown Act, what is a meeting subject to the Brown Act. We'll talk about social media use because there's been some recent changes in the Brown Act, in the law with regard to the use of social media networks. We'll talk about legislative bodies and members that are subject to the Brown Act. I'll talk about public meeting procedures and the rights of the public to participate in the process. I'll talk about the COVID-19 orders that are currently still in place, but that could change come June. I'll talk about closed session and then also enforcement of the Brown Act, because there are opportunities for interested persons and members of the public to enforce the Brown Act to ensure that agencies are complying with its requirements. All right, so if I could move on to slide 2, and this is just a placeholder of the section we're going to move into. So we're going to talk about the intent of the Brown Act, public participation and government transparency. So moving on to slide 3. So it's really important just to have a general understanding that the Brown Act, really, the entire rationale is to ensure that all actions and deliberations of the body, of this Board of Trustees, or any legislative body that is subject to the Brown Act, that it occurs in the open, that it occurs in an open public meeting. That's just the general gist of the Brown Act. The people of the state don't yield their sovereignty to the legislative body that is entrusted with management or oversight of the agency. And so to ensure that the people do not yield their sovereignty, they have to be a part of the process. And the law requires that. So moving on to the next slide, number 4. It's really meant to facilitate public participation in local government. And if you always remember that, then it can help you as a board member if you're faced with an issue that maybe you're uncertain of. You just think in the back of your head, the intent of the Brown Act is to ensure public participation. 9 times out of 10, that'll help you come up with an answer that you may not have, or may have a question with regard to what your obligations are. In 2004, the California Constitution was actually amended by the voters to, in essence, codify within the California Constitution that meetings of public bodies and all writings of public bodies are open to the public. So in addition to the Brown Act, which was authorized by the legislature, the people have actually voiced their desire to be a part of the process by voting to amend the California Constitution. Now, the Brown Act comes up often in litigation, and the courts have liberally interpreted its requirements, always focusing and erring on the side of public participation, public transparency. The courts very often tend to favor that way. So as an attorney and as counsel for the district, we like to avoid litigation because we know where the courts are going to land on these kinds of issues. So it's good to have a very informed understanding of the Brown Act, its obligations, to help you navigate through its requirements. So I'm going to turn to page 5 in the slides. So what's the general rule? The general rule is all meetings of the legislative body of a local agency shall be open and public, and all persons shall be permitted to attend any meeting of the legislative body of a local agency except as otherwise provided in this chapter. So all meetings of the board have to occur in the open with the ability of the public to participate. I'll talk a little bit more about specific types of meetings, but that's the general rule. There are limited exceptions to that general rule which allow for closed sessions, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about those specific exceptions. But again, the general rule is everything is open to the public. And why is that? Because that's consistent with the rationale of the Brown Act and what the voters have said in the California Constitution, that they want to be a part of the process. So to ensure that they're a part of the process, it has to occur in the public. All right. So what is a meeting? A meeting is defined in the Brown Act as any congregation of a majority of the members of the legislative body at the same time and location, including teleconferencing, a teleconference location, to hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. So let's talk about the elements of that statute. Any congregation of a majority of the members. So for this district, you have a 5-member board. I work with many districts that have 7-member boards. So the rules still apply the same way, the numbers just work out a little differently. But with a 5-member board, anytime a majority of that member, of those members of the board congregate, get together, or in the same room, and have a conversation, discussion about anything that falls within the subject matter jurisdiction of the district, that is considered a meeting. If that occurs and it's not properly agendized and noticed, it's an unlawful meeting. And there are consequences that can occur as a result of that kind of an act. Now, let's talk it through a little bit more. If it's 3 members or of a 5-member board that are talking about maybe Marie Huggins' recipe for root beer cake, and I don't know if you've had it, but it's awesome.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. But if 3 members of the board are talking about that recipe, it's not a meeting. It's not subject to the Brown Act. Why? Because it's not a matter within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. So it's not considered a meeting. So it doesn't have to be agendized. It doesn't have to be noticed. So those are key distinctions to understand as to when the obligations of the Brown Act trigger, because they can be triggered in an informal setting. It doesn't have to be a formally agendized, noticed meeting in order for those obligations and responsibilities to trigger. And that's why it's key to understand exactly what a meeting is, so that you can navigate those issues. Now, just to talk a little bit more about some of those specific words listed there. Deliberate, what is that? Well, that means that there's some back and forth or some collective acquisition of thoughts or an exchange of information. Action taken. Action taken means basically that, an act by the majority of the board to either adopt some action or maybe to reach a commitment in a direction that the board is going to move forward in, or to take an actual vote of the body. All right, moving on to slide 8. What is a CIRA meeting?
I'm sorry, let me interrupt for a second. The screen is frozen, so we're not able to see anything. Except Scott, and he's frozen. There we go. Thank you.
All right. So, what is a serial meeting? Now, you probably heard this phrase often. A serial meeting basically is an unlawful meeting of a majority of the members of the board. But specifically, a serial meeting is defined as a majority of the members of the legislative body shall not, outside a meeting authorized by the Brown Act, use a series of communications of any kind, directly or through intermediaries, to discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item of business that is within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. So, in essence, you may not discuss matters within the jurisdiction of this body outside a called meeting. And I have some examples to illustrate that in just a bit. So moving on to number 9, or page 9. What is not a serial meeting? An employee or official of the district may engage in separate conversations or communications outside of a meeting with members of the body in order to answer questions or provide information. We call this the one-way communication rule, where perhaps a staff member or the superintendent provides a board update. One-way information, where information is provided to all members of the board. It's not a called meeting. It might be an email. It might be some other memo that's issued to members of the board. But that is not considered a serial meeting, as long as that individual who is providing the information does not share with other members of the board what trustee's position is, or comments or thoughts are of an item that's within the district's or the board's jurisdiction. So I have some nice graphics here to help illustrate this. So looking at slide number 10, this is a prohibited serial meeting. It's not okay. In this example, you have a 7-member board. So trustee number 1 is having direct communications with another individual. That individual happens to be trustee number 2. And they're talking about items that are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. Let's say maybe there was a news report that one of the sites, maybe the high school, was broken into while schools are closed, and there was a number of electronic equipment that was stolen. And it's kind of the talk that's going on right now in the community, and this is actually a true story for one of my other clients, but that would not be okay if trustee 1 spoke to trustee 2, then to trustee 3, and then to trustee 4, because now we have a majority of this 7-member board that are having these communications. It doesn't require that the 4 members of the 7-member board are all sitting in one room, or sitting or standing in a group talking to each other about that break-in at the high school. That hypothetical break-in at the high school. I don't want anybody to think that there was a break-in at the high school. There wasn't. But for a 5-member board, if 3 individuals have that conversation, that's a prohibited serial meeting. And why is that prohibited? Well, because the public's not there. The public doesn't know that these 3 members of the board were going to have a conversation about this issue that's in the news, that's of public importance, of community importance. So that's why it's a prohibited meeting, a prohibited serial meeting. Now, again, if those 3 members of a 5-member board were having a conversation about Marie Huggins' root beer cake recipe, not an issue, because it's not something within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. Maybe it had something to do with something in the community of interest, but not within the jurisdiction of the board. Maybe there was an issue with the city council. That would be okay. If they're not happy about who won the Super Bowl, that's okay, because it's not within the subject matter jurisdiction. The problem that can happen, though, the problem that can happen though, is if you're having a conversation with the majority of the members of the board about something that's totally fine, but conversation or while you're there, hey, topic comes up that's within the jurisdiction, that's where an issue can arise. So it's important to always be mindful of what's being discussed. I think someone wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, it was me. I'm just kind of curious, how would I mean, I know a break-in at the high school is relevant to the district, but how does that fall under things that we would have authority over? I'm just kind of curious how that would relate to our business as a board.
Well, let me add another fact. If the break-in at the high school involves students of the high school, or maybe another district high school, or another district school, so potentially in that situation, you're gonna have a student discipline issue that might come before the board involving an expulsion, perhaps. So that's how it would potentially fall under the jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Even if it didn't involve a student, but it involved district property, it could be an issue which the board might take some action or give direction to administration to follow up on this, or to work with law enforcement, or so on. So it's still an item that could potentially fall within the jurisdiction of the board. Okay.
Thank you, Scott. That makes sense.
You're welcome. Moving on to slide 11. So this is an example or an illustration of one-way communication, right? So at the center there, staff member, maybe the superintendent, is providing information through maybe a Friday update or some other type of update that information is being shared with the board members. And that's totally fine. I've actually, as legal counsel, from time to time, I don't believe with Center, but with other clients I work with, depending on the matter, I might sometimes be asked by administration to send an update to board members. And in that capacity, if I'm sending it out one way, that's totally permissible. So moving on to slide 12, this is another example of permissible communication. So in this illustration, you have staff sending out that information to the trustees, and individual trustees coming back to that staff member to ask questions, to get additional information, and so on. And that's entirely fine. However, if during that question and answer opportunity with staff, a trustee asks, well, what does trustee 2 think about this? Now we have a problem, because the Brown Act specifically prohibits that. All right, moving on to slide 13. This one looks crazy, but it happens, especially when you deal with emails. Now, this is an example or an illustration of a prohibited meeting occurring by email. So in this situation, you have the staff member sending out, let's just call it the Friday update, to all of the trustees. And unfortunately, trustee 1 doesn't reply all. And now we have some discussion going on, because trustee 1 has now responded to the information that was provided with a question or some other comment. And other members on that email chain of the board are now aware of trustee 1's thoughts or position perhaps on this item or items that were in the staff communique shared with all of them. That's a problem. And one of the issues that can arise when a serial meeting occurs is it could lead, or it may be justification to invalidate a future action of the board. And again, what is the problem with this issue or this item occurring? Is in essence, you have an electronic meeting occurring where the public is not present, the public is not able to see what's going on, or hear what's going on, or read the conversation that's going on. And so that's where the issues arise. Okay. Moving on to slide 14. All right, so let's talk about some situations that aren't considered a meeting, that don't fall under the Brown Act obligations or requirements. So having individual contacts or conversations between a member of the board and any other person. And any other person might be a member of the public. Those are entirely fine. They're not subject to the Brown Act, thank goodness. Attendance of a majority of the board at a conference or a similar gathering that's open to the public, where issues of general concern are discussed. And a great example of this would be perhaps the CSBA conference. I would imagine at some point you all will be attending those in person again, hopefully. That's a great example of where the entire board, or perhaps a majority of the board, travels to attend the conference, to mingle with their colleagues or peers from other districts, to attend presentations and other training sessions and so on, to get information and to learn about, you know, what issues are facing school districts. And in that kind of a context, it's entirely fine for a majority of the members of the board to talk and discuss issues of general concern. Okay, what else is not a meeting? In slide 15, attendance of a majority of the members at a open and publicized meeting of another organization. For example, maybe a PTA meeting or a neighborhood watch meeting. That would be totally fine if a majority of the members are in attendance. There's not an issue with that. The Brown Act carves out these exceptions. Moving on to slide 16. An attendance of a majority of the members at a meeting of another body of the local agency, of the agency. So let's say perhaps the district's school site council. One of the school site councils at one of the sites is having a meeting. And it just so happens that a majority of the members of the board attend. It's permissible under the Brown Act for that to occur. As long as they're not discussing things that should be discussed at a board meeting, you're fine. Or perhaps maybe a majority of the members of the board attend a meeting of another agency, like a city council meeting. Though that's entirely permissible as well. Now moving on to slide 17. Attendance of a majority of the members of the board at a purely social or ceremonial occasion. Party, a celebration, something like that. Hooray, right? That is entirely permissible. The advice, though, that I always share with clients that I work with is, and this just kind of comes from where I grew up, spent a lot of time in the ocean. When the ocean is rough, we used to say, when in doubt, stay out. Right? If the ocean's rough, doesn't look safe, when in doubt, stay out. Same thing if you're attending some kind of a function or a meeting and there's a number of, you see a majority of your board, your colleagues there, 3 or 4 of them there, and you feel like, yeah, you know, maybe I should stay out, maybe I shouldn't sit amongst them. Follow that intuition if you're getting that voice telling you not to do that. Because the other thing that can occur, and I've had it happen with some clients, is the appearance to members of the public. You know, if members of the public are in a meeting and they see all 5 members of the board, or 3 members of the board, or 4 members of the board sitting in a circle or all clustered next to each other talking about something, it's real easy for a member of the public to look at that and think, that looks like an unofficial meeting. What are they talking about? You might be talking about Marie Huggins' root beer cake recipe, right? But they don't know that. There might be the appearance that somehow an improper meeting is occurring, and then the superintendent has to deal with trying to dispel that misunderstanding and so on. So again, when in doubt, stay out is my advice. All right, moving on to slide 18, and social media use. Actually, slide 19, so AB 992 amended the Brown Act's prohibition of serial meetings to permit certain social media communications. So a board member may communicate via social media to answer questions, to provide information to the public, back and forth with members of the public, or to solicit information from the public regarding something that's within the board's jurisdiction. So it is permissible because the legislature recognizes that social media is here to stay, and so much communication goes on through that format that there needed to be some understanding codified in the law to give some parameters for board members to follow. And so these examples that are listed on this slide are permissible. However, there are some limitations. In slide 20, the members of the board may not use social media to discuss amongst themselves official business. So it would not be permissible for members of the board, say, to visit the district's Facebook site, Facebook site, and discuss back and forth an issue involving something within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. Maybe there's some facility that's being considered for renovation, and this is hypothetical. That would be something that falls within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. And so if a member brought that up, or maybe that was a topic that a member of the public brought up in a Facebook post, and then trustee A commented, trustee B commented, that would be prohibited because the legislature has said very clearly that members of the body may not use it to discuss amongst themselves social business. And even though members of the public are part of that, it's not a formally agendized and noticed meeting, if you will. And so other individuals in the public are not aware that that discussion is going on, and they're not there to participate. I hear someone wanting to ask a question.
Yeah, it's me again, Kelly. So let's say one of us is on Facebook and someone asks a question and we respond to their question. Others of us have them as friends, we see what they respond. Would that not be kind of like a reply all? Would it be similar to that, where I'm seeing what her response is to this person, so therefore I know what his or her opinion on it is? I mean, that really gets pretty, like, slicing it thin.
Right, and that's something that the statute doesn't cover. So you might be, and that's an aspect of social media, you might be monitoring or just happen to see that there's some conversation or discussion by one of your colleague trustee members on, let's say, Facebook. There's nothing that prohibits you from viewing that comment or thought that's shared, but the law does prohibit you as a member of the board from responding to that communication. So if that individual, that first trustee that makes the comment, that's it. Only that individual can comment. By our reading of the statute, the law prohibits any subsequent board member from commenting further or responding. Because again, that leads to a potential discussion of an issue within the subject matter jurisdiction, and it's not properly noticed or agendized. Now again,
All right.
if the conversation is all about Kansas should have won the Super Bowl, or something that's totally different, pictures of grandchildren, that's fine.
Yeah.
The limitation only occurs when it's an item of business, of district business.
Just to clarify.
Okay, I'd like to take it one step further and then I'll let it go. But so let's say board member A gets a question from the public and they respond to it, and then that's the end of it. No one else responds to that thread. Now let's say either that member of the public or another member of the public posts something to a different board member. like, but it's the same subject, but like, you know, Jane, sends a question to board member A, and John sends a question to board member B. Board member A and B can see each other's responses, but they're not commenting or responding. We're still okay, right?
You're still okay. You're still okay.
Okay.
It's starting to sound like a potential serial meeting, but the difference is the board members are not utilizing an intermediary to find out what the other board members think or what their position is on an item. What you're describing would be analogous to a member of the public or perhaps the press interviewing one trustee about an item within the district business, and then interviewing another trustee, and interviewing the third trustee, and then writing a story about it, and then all the trustees read the article and now know, at least believe they know what, based on the report, what other trustees feel. That would not be a serial meeting because the board is not actively utilizing an individual as an intermediary. And that would be similar to the scenario you share where, you know, these individuals are going to different social network sites or home pages of trustees and asking the same question to find out what each board member thinks about it. You may find out about it, but you didn't utilize that individual to find that information out, so it would not be a serial meeting. But you know, this law is new, and there's no case law on it. It hasn't been litigated yet, so I imagine at some point it'll wind up in the courts.
Can you clarify? Oh, sorry, I apologize. Can you clarify something that you had mentioned earlier about serial meetings and intermediaries? It wasn't about social media, but did you state that if a staff member or another board member communicates with individual board members and then shares what they know about that individual board member's positions or thoughts or ideas on an issue, that gets us into trouble with the Brown Act, potentially?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Yes.
I couldn't hear what
She asked, going back to my prior review of serial meetings and communication where a staff member shares information with a member of the board, that would be okay, but it would not be okay if that staff member shares thoughts or positions of one board member with other board members.
So, just to clarify, for the serial meetings, it said if it involves a majority of the board. For social media, even 2 is enough to make it a violation.
They have not, the law does not make a distinction of a majority.
Okay. And then one other thing, can we possibly get the volume turned up on that with the air conditioner going? It's getting a little bit hard to hear.
Could you repeat the question?
I was asking, with the serial meetings, it said it needed to involve a majority of the board to be a violation, but with social media, it does not require that it be a majority. So even if it's 2 board members, that's enough to potentially have a violation.
Correct.
Sometimes we would have a situation where a teacher would come to me and tell me something, and I would have no idea that she went to Del Rey and told Del Rey something and said, well, I talked to Nancy and Nancy said this. So Del Rey and I are totally in the dark as
Right.
far as it being a violation.
And in that type of a situation, even if a trustee is not utilizing that individual as an intermediary, it could still result in that individual becoming an intermediary. If that individual comes to a trustee and says, well, you know, trustee A told me this and trustee B told me this, and that's where trustee C should say, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it.
Because I can see in a situation, and I hope nobody gets offended by this, but when we're in union negotiations and things get ugly, I can see where something like that might be set up, where board members are totally in the dark is what's being said. And then all of a sudden they're screaming, Brown Act, you know?
Right.
And we were totally innocent, but it's still being put out there.
Right. And it's, you know, any violation of the Brown Act is always gonna be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, so it's gonna depend on the specific facts. But I can see where a situation like that could arise, and someone who's not intentionally being used as an intermediary becomes an intermediary because they are sharing information that they received from other board members with a third board member. And I can see where that could potentially create an issue. That's why it's advisable to always be cognizant of that and be wary about, you know, receiving information from others when they tell you they talked to other trustees about the issue. Okay, moving on to slide 21. The new law also prohibits you from using emojis, right? So you can't even utilize or make a comment through a digital icon that expresses any type of reaction. Thumbs up, heart, a smiley face, anger face, or any of those. You can't even use emojis, because that would be enough to communicate a trustee's position on an item. All right, moving on to slide 22, talking a little bit about legislative bodies and members. So there are other legislative bodies within the district that could potentially be subject to the Brown Act as well. So if there were a committee, let's say there were a committee that was created by resolution or some other formal action of the board, then that body could potentially be subject to the Brown Act. And that would require those meetings to be noticed and agendized and so on. Moving to slide 24 to discuss that in a little more detail. So an advisory committee that's composed solely of members of the board, less than a quorum. So if there were an advisory committee that involved only 2 members of this board, and it was purely advisory, then that type of a committee would not be subject to the Brown Act. So an example of that would be setting up a committee to assist with reviewing applicants to fill a trustee vacancy. That would be an example. A standing committee, if the board were to establish a standing committee that had continuing subject matter jurisdiction over some item or issue, that type of a committee would also be subject to the Brown Act, requiring their meetings to be noticed and agendized. All right, moving on to slide 25. Now that applies specifically to committees that might be established by the board. If the superintendent, however, were to establish, let's say, a blue ribbon committee to review some issue of interest, that would not be subject to the Brown Act unless the superintendent were solely acting to create this blue ribbon committee, really at the urging of the board. And so if that were the situation, then that committee, that blue ribbon committee, would likely still be subject to the Brown Act. But if it was purely something that the superintendent wanted to move forward with to assist him in providing some direction or information to the board, that type of a committee would not be subject to the Brown Act. All right, moving on to slide 26. Some other examples of meetings involving district players with other individuals that are not subject to the Brown Act would be your general union negotiations. So a district's negotiation team meeting with the teachers or the classified union team, those meetings are not subject to the Brown Act. Along those lines, there is a ERA exception, and it's in the Government Code Section 3549.1A. And that basically allows the board to convene an executive session to give direction to the negotiations team about negotiations. And those types of meetings are not subject to the Brown Act. So to illustrate that, I'll give you an example of how that comes up. If we are in, say, mediation, having difficult negotiations with the union, and we're in a mediation with a state mediator, and we want to get direction from the board on a specific item, maybe salary or compensation is that issue, or some other provision in the contract. And if we want to get direction from the board, that HERA exception would allow the superintendent to call the members of the board to convene an executive session, maybe via telephone conference, where we could receive direct direction from the board specific to negotiations. That type of a meeting does not require an agenda, doesn't require prior notice. It is a very limited exception in ERA, which is the Educational Employment Relations Act that governs all negotiations for school districts. It's a very limited exception. But my advice to clients is when you use that exception, make sure that the conversation or communication is limited to negotiations, similar to a closed session meeting, where you're limited to what's been agendized for closed session. Any questions on that one? I find it to be very useful in negotiations when you get to the point where mediation, or maybe you go on a fact finding and you're trying to, I've had to use it numerous times with other clients, trying to reach a conclusion, but you need a quick answer from your board. So it's a very convenient exception to have.
Is that the only exception?
Yes, that's the only exception specific to negotiations.
So that's generally what we do in our closed session, is, discussions about negotiations or other exceptions to the Brown Act. Would that be the same thing?
I didn't hear that.
I said generally that's what we do in our closed session, so is that essentially the same thing as an executive meeting?
It's similar in that your closed session meeting to discuss negotiations could give direction to the negotiations team about a specific item. The only difference is that in closed session, you are actually agendizing that meeting, or that closed session is part of an agendized meeting, and it's subject to the notice requirement, whether it's 72 hours for a regular meeting or 24 hours for a special meeting. This ERA exception, it's useful in a situation where we're in mediation, or we're in fact-finding, or we're really close to reaching a deal in regular negotiations, and we need to be able to make a decision or a proposal right then, and we're really close, and we know that we're close to reaching a deal. That ERA exception allows that executive session to happen without the necessity of posting a notice and having it agendized. But again, it's very limited to just giving, to discussing the positions and to give direction to the negotiations team.
Well, that's where we would get into the ratified versus, right?
No, it's very specific to, we're in the middle of, think of it as really tedious negotiations, and it's timely that we need to make a decision. We would convene only on, as it relates to the negotiation piece. We would talk with the board, get direction at that, just like a closed session where you guys give us direction. This could be if we were in really tenacious, I guess you'd say, negotiations, and you need the answer right now. You don't have to agendize it, wait 72 hours. You could convene a meeting right then, or you can convene a call right then there and get the direction from the board.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, the prime example where it comes up most often is if you're in mediation.
Right.
You've got a state mediator helping you, and that state mediator has gotten you as close as that mediator can get you, and it might be a little bit more than maybe we were authorized, but we need immediate we needed a green light from the board right away, we can utilize that exception and not have to wait 24 hours for a special meeting or 72 hours for a regular meeting.
And you could conceivably use a serial meeting for that type of discussion, right? Where
No, it wouldn't be a serial meeting. It would be a meeting, it would be an executive session where members of the board can participate telephonically, typically telephonically.
If everyone wasn't available together at one time, you could use that exception and just do it through phone call then.
Yes.
Couldn't you? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. I mean, it's just not another option.
Okay, moving on to slide 27, public meeting procedures and public participation. On slide 28, just some of the key requirements that the Brown Act imposes or obligates the district to comply with. For example, specifying that all agendas and any other writings that are part of a board meeting, they are all public documents. They're all subject to being provided to members of the public. Now, there are exceptions under the Public Records Act regarding certain types of documents. So there might be an example where a document might not be subject to disclosures if perhaps you're meeting in closed session on a litigation matter and you're provided, legal counsel provides advice or some memo or something that's attorney-client privilege. That would be an example where that type of a document would not be a public document subject to disclosure. Okay, moving on to slide 29.
Before you move on, one question we had come up in the past was whether or not we should report closed session. What's your feeling on that?
I don't advise, there's no obligation to record it or to take minutes, and I don't recommend it. Okay, so slide 29, dealing with public records, if it relates to an agenda item for an open session, it has to be provided or made available to the public at the same time it's made available to the board. Sometimes situations occur where perhaps items are agendized on the agenda for a meeting, but perhaps the document related to that agenda item is not quite ready yet. In that type of a situation, the Brown Act does allow for that document to be provided at a later date, so long as it's made available to the public at the same time it's provided to the board. I've had that occur in a couple of situations where a resolution was still being worked out on a specific issue, and there was a placeholder in the agenda about a resolution, but it hadn't been finalized yet. And at the meeting, there were copies of the resolution made available to the public at the same time that that resolution was provided to the board. If that situation arises, and we try to avoid those kinds of situations, but from time to time they do arise, the Brown Act does allow for that. There is an allowance that that would still make it possible for the board to take action on that item, as long as that item is provided to the public at the same time the board gets it. From time to time, individuals or third parties will bring documents to a board meeting. You may see this in public comment where an individual has some kind of a white paper or something they want to distribute to members of the board. And it's interesting, under the Brown Act, even though it's not the district's document or created by staff or any member of the district, the Brown Act requires the district to provide copies of that third-party document to members of the public if they request it. So if someone comes to a board meeting during public comment and says, I want to share this document with the board, and someone in the public says, hey, I want a copy of that, Brown Act requires the district to make a copy of it and provide it to them after the meeting. Okay. All right, so moving on to slide 30. As far as, with regard to, okay, I think I may have gotten ahead of myself. Yes, I did get ahead of myself. All right, so documents that are prepared by any other person must be made available after the meeting. Okay. Slide 31. So talking about agendas, the agenda for a regular meeting must be conspicuously posted at least 72 hours prior to the time of the meeting in a location freely accessible to all members of the public. So moving on to slide 32, an agenda must specify the time and location of the regular meeting. AB 2257 passed several years ago, requiring as of 2019 that if the school district maintains a website, that it has to include a prominent direct link on the home page so that members of the public can very easily access that agenda. It can't be buried. Prior to this law going into effect, it wouldn't be uncommon to look at a school district's website and try to find the board agenda, and it's just buried. You'd have to click one spot and click another and click again before you'd finally, and then click a few more times before you might find it. Well, the problem with that is members of the public have become now, in this age, very reliant on accessing web information from websites. And so if the district maintains a website in order to promote or enhance the public's participation in the process, it's got to be easy for them to find that agenda so they can make a decision as to whether or not they want to show up at that meeting and discuss in public comment and get involved in the process. I'm happy to say the center gets an A for me. The link is very prominent, easily accessible. It says right there on the home page, the current board meeting agenda. I can tell you that there's still some districts that I wouldn't give an A to, so.
Scott,
Yes,
in addition to the website posting, are we still required to post paper copies at all of the school sites, or is that in lieu of the paper posting?
you're still required. You're still required to make those old school, physical postings. What the law does require is if you do have a website, you're obligated to make it available on your website as well. I think there may have been districts that still didn't have websites. I don't think that's the case now. All of the districts I work with have websites, but at some time, there were some that still hadn't made that investment. Okay, moving on to slide 33. Talking about regular meeting agendas. So a regular meeting agenda may not be changed within the 72 hours preceding the meeting. So once an agenda gets posted within that 72-hour period, it cannot be changed. There's very limited exceptions to that. One would be where a majority of the board determines that an emergency exists. During that board meeting, the board determines there is an emergency and we need to add an item to the agenda. An emergency might be a work stoppage, maybe there's some crippling activity, maybe a terrorist act, something like that, something that's so far out there that couldn't have been foreseen in that 72-hour period when the notice got, when the agenda was published, that a majority of the board could take action. This slide lists a few other situations where 2/3 of the board members determine there's a need for immediate action, or when you're continuing a postponed meeting. In those type of situations, I always recommend consult with legal counsel just to make sure that you're navigating the requirements. Because the last thing you want to do is take some kind of an action to amend an agenda, and then it turns out that you didn't really, because sometimes it's like threading a needle. You don't want to take action to revise an agenda discuss an item, take action on that item, and then it turns out you didn't thread that needle right and it's invalid. So if that kind of a situation arises, that's when you ask the superintendent to text the lawyer and they'll respond and help out. Another thing that we do, and I have it listed here on this slide, is if something happens between that 72-hour period and it's an important item of business, it's not uncommon to tack on a special meeting. A special meeting only requires 24 hours notice. So if something comes up, 48 hours before that next meeting, you can utilize the special meeting notice, 24-hour notice requirement, and add a special meeting either before or after the regular meeting. I don't recommend inserting it in the middle. That can be confusing to the public. Okay, moving on to slide 34. So, the key requirement with regard to agendas is that they reasonably apprise the public of matters that are going to be considered or before the board. We need to provide sufficient detail so that a member of the public can make a decision as to whether or not, you know what, I'm going to miss the game tonight, I'm going to go to that board meeting. Right? There's got to be enough information there that they can make that decision. I include a citation to this Carlson versus Paradise Unified School District. That case, crazy case. In that situation, the school district agenda said continuation school site change. That's all it said. Continuation school site change. That's all it said. What the action involved, though, was the board considering and ultimately taking action to close or discontinue elementary education at an elementary site and moving the continuation school to that elementary site. And that agenda was not descriptive enough to let the parents of that elementary school know that their kid's school was going to close and was going to be replaced with this continuation school. So families that were affected went to court and they were able to get an injunction to stop the board and the district from moving forward. And so as a result, we have this sort of, this generalized 20-word rule, which means if you can get it all within 20 words, then you're probably okay. Your agenda doesn't have to be 20 words long, but if you provide a general description and it's within 20 words, you're probably okay. If you have an issue or you're not absolutely certain as to what you should or shouldn't include, then it's always a good idea to reach out to legal counsel to help out with that. We do that regularly. Because again, the last thing you want is like what happened in Paradise, to have an agendized item, action was taken, and then it turns out it was improperly agendized. Now you've got to do a redo and potentially face legal costs in defending against an action like this. All right. Slide 35, we're still talking, now we're talking about special meetings. So a special meeting only requires 24 hours notice. A special meeting may be called by either the president of the board or by a majority of the board. The board may only consider business that's on that specific notice. The board may hold a closed session as part of a special meeting, so you can have closed sessions during special meetings as well. There are some things that you can't do at a special meeting, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. Public speakers must be allowed the opportunity to speak during a special meeting, so you have to have public comment during a special meeting. But public comment can be limited in the special meeting only to items that are on the agenda. Now, the board does have the discretion to allow individuals during public comment to speak about other items as long as they're within the subject matter jurisdiction that might not be on that agenda, but the Brown Act does allow the board and the agenda to limit public comment to only those items that are agendized during a special meeting. All right, moving on to slide 36. This is an example of something that cannot be done at a special meeting. So the law was changed to prohibit action being taken on salaries or compensation, including fringe benefits of any local agency executive. And this was a result of the City of Bell fiasco that happened maybe a decade ago. It's been some time, but those revisions to the Brown Act were a result of what happened in the City of Bell, where they were passing these really generous compensation packages for executives of the city that weren't subjected to public scrutiny. So as a result, anytime you're going to discuss compensation or approved compensation or salary schedules or fringe benefits for an executive of the district, the board can only do those can only take that action at a regular meeting. And why is that? Well, with a special meeting, it only requires 24 hours notice. It's a very small window of notice where members of the public might not know that, hey, they're going to talk about this great compensation package. I want to be a part of it. And so a regular meeting requires 72 hours notice, so it's implied that 72 hours will give the public more opportunity to decide whether or not they want to skip that ball game and participate in the meeting. All right. Notice of the special meeting must be mailed or delivered to the media and posted 24 hours in advance of the meeting. The notice must also be posted on the district's website. Okay, moving on to slide 37. There is another exception to the regular meeting requirement, and that allows for emergency meetings. So an emergency meeting can be called by the president or by a majority of the board. At a minimum, you have to provide at least 1 hour notice to the media, except in a dire emergency where perhaps maybe you can't even give 1 hour. An emergency is defined here as work stoppage, crippling activity that impairs health or safety. This one actually came up quite a few times for several of my clients when everything happened last year in March. I had a number of clients that called emergency meetings when we all learned that schools were going to be shutting down and so on in response to the pandemic. That's totally fine, permissible, and fell within one of the authorized reasons for an emergency meeting. I advise clients, though, to still put it up on the website, call the media, give them at least that 1 hour notice, and also to post wherever you physically post agendas so that we've got it all covered. Even though it's short notice, we're still going forward with the process of trying to make individuals aware of it. In the situation where you're trying to give this 1 hour notice or give notice by telephone, and if telephone service for some reason is not working, then the Brown Act requires the district to still try to make that notice as reasonably possible or soon thereafter. All right, moving on to slide 38. Diving into the rights of the public to participate. So members of the public must be able to address the board regarding items on the agenda before or during the governing board's consideration of the item. Moving on to slide 39. Every regular meeting agenda must provide an opportunity for the public to address the board on any item of interest to the public within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. So it's not limited like a special meeting. What typically happens, in my experience, is a board will set aside a specific time frame at the beginning of the meeting for public comment, and then quite often they'll set time aside under individual items to allow for public comment specific to that item. And that's totally permissible. Moving on to slide 40. So the board, it's within the board's authority to adopt reasonable rules and regulations in order to ensure proper functioning of the meeting. And these types of rules and regulations can regulate time, place, and manner, but they cannot regulate viewpoint, they cannot regulate speech. I've sat through a few meetings where I felt really bad for members of the board and members of administration as I listened to members of the public just unload. I remember sitting in one board meeting where this was a topic of huge community interest, so much so that the regular board meeting was moved to the high school auditorium, and it was packed. And there were news cameras there, and I actually had to present on the item. But I remember sitting there and watching members of the public get up to the podium and just unload on the superintendent and unload on members of the board about how much they disliked the decisions that had been made and so on, and the language got very colorful. And
few of those.
yeah, you know that it happens. People they want to let you know how they feel, and the Brown Act respects that, and there's very little that the board can do when that type of dialogue or those types of words are being thrown at staff or administration. There's very little you can do. The only thing really that the board has the discretion to do is to perhaps recess the meeting to let temperatures cool down a little bit, or if it's becoming a disruption to the meeting, then it might be sufficient where the board could exercise authority to perhaps have that person removed, but that's very limited, and I have never seen that happen, because 9 times out of 10, if you recess the meeting, temperatures cool, and then people come back and they continue to vent. But if I've been to board meetings where we anticipated that there was going to be perhaps physical altercations, and so we've had beefed up security present just as a deterrent against those kinds of things happening. Sometimes those types of issues come up. I think a question is.
Yeah, I have 2 questions with regard to this. First of all, during our, COVID environment where we're meeting remotely and people are sitting in public comment and they're being read by Carol Hunt, our executive secretary, she does not have to repeat those words in the correspondence, right? I mean, that's not, she doesn't have to say them, correct?
I would say she does. I would say she does, but what she could do is perhaps spell them out instead of actually saying the word.
Holy moly.
Because,
Okay, and the other question I have is, would it be appropriate for us to just kindly ask people to refrain from using that language, or is that not acceptable either?
That, in my opinion, is fine. I think the board president or whatever trustee is presiding over the meeting can certainly make that request. In my opinion, you don't have any authority to enforce it, but you can certainly make the request as a courtesy to ask that, and I've seen this happen, especially when children are present. I've seen a board president say, in the interest, because we have so many children present, I would please ask that individuals of the public, please be mindful of the words that you're using because we have so many children present. And that seems to work, and that's totally fine. But if you've got a knucklehead at the podium and they don't care and they want to throw those words, unless it's becoming entirely disruptive to the meeting, you sort of have to just deal with it.
Regarding the public comments being read, if Carol were uncomfortable reading something, would it be acceptable if somebody else read it for her?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody can read it.
Yes. Yeah.
Those comments don't need to be made public, do they?
Yes.
So, for instance, Ms. Carroll is receiving 26 comments via email or however she's getting them. Those need to be public.
They need to be read in public.
But do they need to be presented somewhere in public?
Well,
So, for
they-
instance, would it be attached to a board packet? Like an amendment to a board packet? Or is it fine just saying them out loud?
What's required is under the, and these are all in response to the executive orders that were issued, which basically requires that the public still be allowed to communicate, at least electronically, to share their thoughts or comments electronically. So what a lot of districts have done is set up this arrangement where you can email your comment and your comment will be read to the board. That's all that's required, is that the email is read to the board during public comment. That allows the individual to participate in the process and to communicate their thoughts to the board. That's all that's required. It doesn't have to be part of the packet or anything like that. Now those words become part of the minutes. Those words all get captured in the minutes.
Maybe we could issue that warning regardless in the beginning and say there are children watching this meeting, because I know my grandson watches sometimes. And if you heard Scott say those words, oh boy, Scott would be in trouble.
Okay, yes.
I was just going to say, my plan at this point is to just, when we, most announcements for public comment, is to remind people that they will be read, and out of respect for the person reading them, and all the participants who are listening in, try to avoid those words, and then let them know that if they do, if they're using those words, that they'll be spelled out. It'll take all the innocence out of it anyway.
Yeah.
The other.
Is that a form of censorship, though? Is that a form of censorship? Because in effect, you are altering what that individual has said. And so is that permissible for the board to attempt to censor any public comment in any way?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's censoring it if I'm just asking them to try and refrain from those words, and then God is the one that mentioned spelling them, so that's why I was going with that. If not, you know, Mr. Lear has already offered to read them if that needs to be the case. We could go about that if we're more comfortable with that. That's why I brought up what I was thinking, this is my plan, because I want to make sure that we're, first of all, following the rules, and second of all, that we're all on board with you know, the approach.
I would suggest, remember, we only had, I think we've had, of all the public comments, we had one that had some words. And I'm sorry, I'm not happy to read it, but I will do it, because I agree. I think we should read it as it is. I just think that's above board, that's the right thing to do. I'm happy to read that. Again, we've had one out of the last year that had that.
I don't feel anybody should be forced to read something that's offensive to them.
Right, but we're trying to communicate the public's wishes and their comments, so I think it's appropriate that we unfortunately do it, because otherwise, I do worry that we would be considered, now are we putting our emphasis on it or trying to take away from their meaning? Again, it doesn't come up that often, it hasn't, so if we do that, and plus we're transitioning meeting in public, so hopefully that will be behind us.
Until the kids find out they can make you say bad.
I think that virtual meetings are with us for a bit as we're still in a global pandemic. And I agree with you, Scott, that we shouldn't attempt to censor any public members' comments. Then we're getting into subjective, measurements of what is a profanity to whom and how, and I think that could just get absolutely absurd.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Dr. Lee. I have no issue with those words being used. I was just thinking for Mrs. Hunt, I know that it has come up as a concern for her, so whatever we can do to avoid that, let's just put a contingency plan in place, and I won't say anything at all. We'll just let Carol know that if she needs someone else to read one, we could just do that. Does that sound okay for everybody?
Yep.
It sounds like the superintendent is designated reader
Yep.
Bad language.
of colorful comments.
That's fine.
No, happy to read them all, no problem.
Okay, continuing with slide 40, so the board does have the authority to establish clear maximum time limits, subject to extension or reduction. This is typically in your board bylaws. It's not uncommon for either a 2 or 3 minute public comment limitation to be in place. Those are totally permissible. I've also seen boards where there's a lot of interest in an item, but to ensure that the meeting can be conducted in a timely fashion. I've also seen boards, and in my opinion, it's within their authority to do it, to set maybe a block of time limit under a certain item. Like I remember dealing with a charter school petition where there was a lot of public comment anticipated, and in that situation they set up, I believe, a one hour block for public comment under that individual item.
That's a good idea.
And so that would be a reasonable regulation, in my opinion, for the board to adopt, as long as the public is being allowed to comment.
Regarding the extension or reduction, we typically have not been enforcing the time limit. We don't get many comments that go over it, and when we do, we've just been kind of enjoying engaging with the public. My concern is that if somebody isn't granted the extension when somebody else is, that we could be accused of giving preferential treatment to some and not to others.
Yeah, you know, it's that's why I think it's better for consistency to stick to your 3 limit, or whatever your limit is for public comment, if it's 2 minutes or 3 minutes, because those issues can arise. There might be that perception, even if it's totally unfounded, there could be that perception that why is that individual being allowed more time? And I've seen this pop up where an individual during public comment says, oh, and I also would like to read a comment, or they'll come up and say, well, you know, Mr. Smith has given me his 2 minutes, you know, to expand that individual's time, and those kind of issues can pop up. I think the best practice is to stay the course. If you have a 3 minute or 2 minute time limit, that applies to everybody. And I've had some boards where they actually cut the mic when 2 minutes, or it turns off. There's someone that's monitoring the 2 minutes that turns the mic off. Doesn't always go over well.
Sometimes you're just agitating the crowd that way. So
Right.
we've always figured that it's better to let them get it out and, you know, say their piece if we have time to do that.
It's kind of a case by case, and what's the issue, and who's up there speaking. And now I've had trustees that I've worked with recognizing that if an individual speaks slower and has a hard time, you know, speaking, that they might be more inclined to give that person a little more time. But I think the best practice is, if you can, try to stick to your limit and apply it evenly and consistently with all of your speakers. But again, very often it's going to be at the discretion of the board president that's presiding over the meeting, or whatever trustee is presiding over the meeting. It's typically going to be that discretion, and if the president or whoever's presiding can ask the board, do we want to extend public comment? Do we want to extend the opportunity for individuals to speak for a longer period of time? And there might be something of interest there. It's not the easiest thing to navigate. It just depends on how the meeting is going.
Yeah. I didn't quite hear what Mr. Bruno was saying, but I think the gist of it was that if one person sees that 3 minute limit on the agenda and they keep their public comment to 3 minutes, and then the next person comes up and speaks for 10 minutes, then it gives a sense of preferential treatment, and also the person who only spoke 3 minutes feels like they weren't able to participate to the extent that they should have or could have. So I understand what you're saying, Scott. I also understand what Nancy's saying about trying to make sure people are able to get things out. So maybe what we do is we extend the time a little bit longer, but then make a very clear announcement that we're doing that to keep things equitable and that they will be limited to whatever the amount of time is.
Yes, I agree. Whatever you can do to maintain consistency is the better practice, is the best practice. Okay, and then the last bullet point there on that slide 40 just talks about, how the legislative body shall not prohibit public criticism of policies, procedures, programs, or services of the agency or of the acts or omissions of the legislative body. That comes right out of the Brown Act. So there is a recognition that, the public is allowed to make those criticisms if they have them.
Can you draw a line between that and the public criticism of employees?
I would say no.
No? No line?
No line. No
So we
line.
can let them stand up there and tear a teacher apart, true or untrue?
Yes,
Wow.
yes.
Okay.
You can regulate time, manner, and place, but you cannot regulate viewpoint or content of the speech. It's
Is that only from the comments from the public? Or is it from anyone? I mean,
anyone that's speaking during public comment from the podium has the First Amendment right to say what they want to say.
okay.
And that's, I'll share I sat through a board meeting where I heard, and it looked orchestrated to me, but there were half a dozen individuals that got up to that podium and just unloaded on the superintendent. And it was hard to sit there, but they have that right. And there's, as much as the attorney working with that district wanted to stand up and take some of the arrows or, slow, there's nothing you can do about it. You have to allow that process to play out. Okay, moving on to slide 41. So AB 1787 went into effect back in 2017, and this really revised the Brown Act with regard to non-English speakers. So if there's an individual that requires or uses a translator, they're allowed twice the amount of time. So if your set time is 2 minutes, and an individual is speaking at the podium and is using a translator, by law they're entitled to twice the time, so they would receive 4 minutes. Now, this doesn't apply if you use simultaneous translation equipment. So that additional time doesn't apply in that type of a situation. It's interesting, the Brown Act has these obligations for more time and so on with regard to translators, but it doesn't require districts to provide translators. It's a common practice for districts that I work with, especially in communities that have a lot of non-English speakers, to provide translators, but it's not a requirement in the Brown Act. Okay, moving on to slide 42. So there's specific rules in the Brown Act about responding to public statements made during public comment. So what the law does allow you to do as a board, when you're sitting at the board, is to briefly respond to a statement made or a question posed by persons making public comments. It doesn't allow for engaging back and forth conversation or discussion with a member at the podium, but if it does allow, for example, sir, I can't hear you, can you repeat yourself? Or sir, you made a comment about the school site, which school site did you make a comment of? I mean, that kind of minimal type of interaction is permissible, but I would say anything beyond that is not permissible. And the reason is because what that results in is possibly conversation of an item, conversation or discussion by the board of an item that this member of the public brings forward during public comment that has not been agendized and that has not been noticed. And so other members of the public who might have an interest in this topic didn't have the opportunity to be aware of it and decide whether or not they wanted to come and participate in the meeting. So the Brown Act is very clear that that interaction is very limited. Typically, I advise clients consistent with the Brown Act is if there's something that requires or maybe warrants follow-up, if a member of the public is sharing information about an item, maybe reporting something that they're aware of that is of interest to the board can give staff direction, please follow up with that individual, let's get their information, and we can decide if it's something that needs to be dealt with at a future meeting. Or perhaps that individual can be provided contact information of the correct staff member to bring their issue to, so that staff can work through the issue within the policies or procedures of the district, if it's a complaint perhaps. Okay. Moving on to slide 43. These are just some typical practices or requirements. So minutes are required to be taken. Minutes are public records of regular meetings. There's no requirement for minutes in closed sessions. No action may be taken by secret ballot. The board must publicly report any action taken and the vote or abstention on that action of each member present for the action. The board can, the public has a right to record any meeting by motion picture, camera, or video, audio tape. I've been to meetings where relatively, well, before COVID, but I've been to meetings where individuals were actually live broadcasting on Facebook of meeting. That's permissible. What you can do is you can designate an area. For example, if there's a matter of huge public interest and there's a lot of news media cameras there, what you can do is you can designate an area in the meeting room where all the cameras can situate themselves so as to minimize the impact or disruption of others in the meeting. So you do have that authority.
Hey, Scott, that just brought up another, with a reminder for me. So if we are having discussion on an agendized item, and we have public comment in regards to that agendized item, and the board members are also allowed to speak on the item, and if they have information from the public, they can share that information as well. Is that correct? Or does it have to come through the public comment process?
Well, I guess it depends on how the board member received that information from the public. I'll share with you an example. I don't know if it answers your question or not, but I recently had a client where they were, during a meeting, one of the board, and I won't share you the client, but I can share you the facts because it was a public meeting, where a member of the board received text messages from the union president, and it was responding to a public comment that was read during public comments. And the text message was basically disputing what had been read during public comment by some other individual who had provided this public comment. And the board member shared what was in that text message. And I got a call during the break. And in my opinion, that is not permissible because that is creating, even though that's a union president, it's not permissible because that created another mechanism to allow a member of the public to communicate with the board, which was not consistent with the mechanisms that the board had put in place to allow for public comment, which was electronic email within by a date specific submitted to the district, which would be read aloud. If that's similar to the scenario you're sharing, my advice would be that that would not be advisable.
Okay, so I'm gonna get a little bit more specific. So public comment was made, something was misread, a person from the public emailed all the board members. One of the board members saw the email, made a correction to the public comment by saying what was in this email. So, if that sort of a situation was to arise again, would you recommend that the board members who saw the email basically reply to them and say, please submit another comment to the public comment process? Or, and then, of course, the concern would be is if they don't have the time to do that, then that might be a problem. But what would you recommend in that situation? That is the exact situation.
In that situation, I would recommend that there be an individual staff member that's designated as the primary person to receive these comments. And then if, or however the comments are being submitted by email, and that if a board member receives a message from a member of the public saying, hey, there's a problem with what was read or something, then that board member should relay that person back to that staff member that's responsible for coordinating receipt of public comment, and have that individual communicate with that staff member. And if there, and that staff member, if there's time to receive, but I didn't get a chance to look at what your requirements were for submitting electronic.
We allow them right up in the moment.
In the moment.
In the moment.
Okay, so if that's the process, then that staff member can relay to that individual. You can submit a correction or submit a statement that I will read during public comment, if public comment's still open, if it happens within that time frame. But I would recommend that the board members funnel those types of direct communications to the designated staff member and let them deal with it. Otherwise, there's the appearance that there's another mechanism for members of the public to communicate with the board, which differs from what's been established.
So in that case, you could just get up on the day and walk over to that person and say, hey, there seems to be a mistake, you should go back to this or email this person. And leave it.
Right.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Right. Okay, so moving on to slide 44. Board may not prohibit or restrict the broadcast of its proceedings. The only exception will be if it's creating a persistent disruption. Any recording made by or at the direction of the board shall be subject to inspection as a public record. So if you record your meetings, they are public records. Inspection of any video or audio recording shall be provided without charge on a machine made available by the district. Moving on to slide 45. So the Brown Act does permit teleconferencing for all purposes in connection with any meeting. Teleconferencing means a meeting of the body of which the members are in different locations connected by electronic means through audio or video or both. However, moving on to slide 46. During the teleconference, at least a quorum of the members of the legislative body must be within the jurisdiction of the local agency. I had a situation a few years back where a trustee was in Maui, and there was an issue of importance, and that trustee needed to participate, and participated for Maui. And that was permissible because the rest of the board were all at the dais, at the board meeting room, and so that person patched in. But the Brown Act also requires that the agenda identify where that individual is going to be telephone conferencing from. And that individual, I kind of chuckled when I found out about it. I shared this with them after, but that individual was in their hotel room participating. And the individual didn't realize that if by chance there had been someone else from the community in Maui and wanted to participate, that board member would have been required by law to let that public member into their hotel room to participate in the board meeting. So I always advise clients, if that happens, ask the hotel for a conference room, a meeting room, or something like that, so that if by chance, and it's a very remote chance, but you never know, if by chance a member of the public just happens to be there, they're not in your personal hotel room.
And it has to be posted on their door.
Yes, and the agenda has to be posted outside the door.
Even in Maui.
Even in Maui. Fortunately for that trustee, that issue didn't arise, but go ahead.
So if we're videotaping from home, we have to be able to allow the public to come into our home and participate in the meeting. Is that correct? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, not under the COVID orders,
Right.
but prior to COVID, or if at some point these orders are lifted, and if a board member were to teleconference into the meeting, and it happens that that location is your home, then by law, a member of the public, if they wanted to, would have to be allowed to participate in the entire meeting from your home, in your home.
Yeah. And we have to post the agenda on our door for 72 hours prior to the meeting.
Yes.
Yeah. So they just go
Wow.
up and say, you know, I'm a homeless guy, but I'm here for the meeting.
And while I'm here, can I use your restroom?
Yeah.
All right, moving on to slide 47. So I'm going to go through the COVID-19 orders. I've been going for about an hour and a half here. Would you like to take a break, or should I continue to move forward?
Just continue.
Continue? Okay.
It's up to you. Do you need to use?
No, I'm fine. Okay. All right, so,
Going back for 1 second, I
Yes.
noticed on the last slide, it said all votes taken during the teleconference meeting must be by roll call. So would that even include, like, the vote we did at the start of this meeting to approve the agenda? We should have done that as a roll call vote?
what you're operating right now under COVID-19 executive orders, so a lot of the requirements, I shouldn't say a lot, many of the requirements have been relaxed.
Okay.
These specific requirements apply prior to COVID orders being in place. And so if there is a member of the board that's teleconferencing in, that vote should occur to ensure that their vote is part of the process.
Okay.
All right, slide 48. So these are some of the Brown Act changes that occurred as a result of some of the governor's COVID-19 executive orders. So the legislative body is authorized to hold public meetings via teleconference without having to provide a physical location from which members of the public may observe the meeting and offer public comment, as long as members of the public are allowed to observe and address the meeting telephonically or otherwise electronically. So a lot of clients have done, or districts that I work with have done as you have, which allow them to participate or observe the meeting via Zoom or whatever platform you're using, and then to submit comments either by phone or by email to be reread. But I also have clients that have figured out that the technology is such that they can actually allow individuals to give public comment virtually. And that's created a host of other issues with individuals not showing their, what's the word? Not showing their video or their visual. And in my opinion, that would be permissible. That would really be no different than, I might be going on a tangent here, but that would be really no different. I don't know if I'll probably date myself, but if you remember the Unknown Comic, I mean, if someone wanted to show up at a board meeting, a regular board meeting, with a paper bag on their head and address the board, there's nothing you could do to tell them to take that paper bag off of their head. And so I analogize that to the issue of where if a district is permitting public comment virtually, and that individual member of the public doesn't want to show their video, and just wants to keep it, you know, with maybe their name or whatever, some other visual, I think that's entirely permissible, and you couldn't prohibit them from participating just because they didn't show their visual, for the same reason as the unknown comic. Okay. Local agencies must still ensure that they comply with ADA accessibility requirements and any notice requirements. So again, this is just a temporary relaxing of the Brown Act. They're eventually going to end. That might be June 15th. We're still waiting to get, I mean, there's still some contingencies with June 15th. That announcement that came out from the governor's office and from California Department of Public Health. But we'll see. Slide 49. Notice of each member's teleconference location is not required, so that was relaxed. Agendas do not have to be posted on all teleconference locations. That was relaxed. And the requirement that at least a quorum of the members are located within the territory of the jurisdiction, that's been relaxed as well. All right, slide 50, these things still apply. The legislative body must have it advertised each time, so the meeting notice requirement is still required. Requests for reasonable accommodations are still required to be adhered to or honored. Legislative body must provide advance notice of the time of and post the agenda for each public meeting, so your posting and agenda requirements are still required. That hasn't been relaxed. And the means by which members of the public may observe the meeting and offer public comment, that has to be included in the notice. All right, slide 51. This was a subsequent order, N3520, which basically allows that more than a quorum of the members of a body can meet with federal or state officials regarding COVID-19 without the need of calling a special official board meeting to allow the free flow of information during the pandemic and so on. And then members are allowed to ask questions in that setting without any formal agendized or noticed meeting. Okay. Slide 52. The orders, though, do not relax the requirements that members take action. The requirements as to what a meeting is that subject that to the Brown Act have not been relaxed. So you're still not authorized to, take any action or discuss amongst yourselves any item of business within the jurisdiction of the body. Those requirements have not been relaxed. They're still in place. Let's see. Slide 53. Again, okay, so the executive orders are apply only during the period in which the state and local officials impose or recommend measures to promote social distancing, including limitations on public events. So it's plausible that these orders might be lifted on June 15th. There's still a lot of uncertainty there because there's a couple of triggers that need to be met. If they're met, we anticipate if they're met, and if the direction is to move forward, for example, the California Department of Public Health issued a publication on the 6th, I believe. In fact, it was just yesterday. They issued a notice that basically, amongst all of the information that was in that notice, said that consistent with this governor's action would be that the expectation that all schools return to full in-person instruction by June 15th. If that plays out, then I suspect or anticipate that there will be some subsequent order or confirmation that these orders are lifted, in which we would go back to pre-COVID Brown Act obligations and requirements and so on. But there's still a lot of uncertainty. There's still other things that need to happen. Okay, moving on to slide 54 in closed sessions. So there are very limited exceptions in which the board can meet outside the public eye in closed session. So those involve threats to public safety or security, personnel issues, if you're going to confer with or receive advice from legal counsel, labor negotiations, issues involving real property transactions, and student discipline. So on slide 56, probably one of the most common closed session items that the board will meet under would involve personnel, and that could include the appointment, employment, evaluation of performance, or discipline or dismissal of an employee. Now, employee does not include a board member, so that exception cannot be used to discuss in closed session maybe an issue with a board member. I actually had, just last year, a member of the public filed a complaint against a board member. And so we had to investigate the complaint, and we're trying to figure out how do we talk about that complaint with the rest of the board, because you can't use the personnel exception, which you would typically use if you were dealing with a complaint against an employee. But because in that situation there was the potential for litigation, because of what the complaint was alleging, we were able, under that exception, to discuss it with the board. But the general rule is that that exception, the personnel exception, does not apply to members of the board. Okay. Let's move on to slide 57. So one of the exceptions is specific for labor negotiations. And so in that context, the board can discuss in closed session with its bargaining team for either represented or unrepresented employees. And those closed sessions can include discussion of the agency's funds, available funds and funding priorities, but they cannot include final action on any proposed compensation. So you can't take any action in closed session, even for negotiations, regarding the compensation of your represented or unrepresented employees. For your represented employees, that's typically going to happen in your 80-1200 process, where the superintendent and the district's CEO is going to certify that the district can afford the compensation that's being proposed. And that has to happen in an open public session. Okay, slide 58, employment contracts. So any contract for superintendent, deputy superintendent, assistant superintendent, or other similar chief administrative officer or chief executive officer shall be ratified in an open session of the governing board, which shall be reflected in the governing board's minutes. And this has to happen at a regular meeting. So anytime you're dealing with compensation or a contract of an executive, it needs to happen in open session. Now you can discuss the contract, in terms of the contract, in closed session, but you cannot approve it in closed session. That action has to happen in open session to allow the public an opportunity to participate in the process. Copies of contracts, any employment contracts, settlement agreements, those are all public. For a settlement agreement, it wouldn't be public until the issue was resolved and settled. But those are all public documents. Employment contracts are all public documents. Moving on to slide 59. So SB 1436 in 2017 also created this responsibility or this obligation of the board to orally report a summary of the recommendation. So as a result of this change in the law, for example, if assistant superintendent's contract is going to be approved, the board has to precede that action by orally reporting out the provisions of the contract with regard to compensation, fringe benefits, and so on, to again give the public another opportunity to participate in the process and be aware of what is being contemplated with regard to compensation for that executive. Okay, Page 60, these are examples of some safe harbor agenda descriptions. So the Brown Act includes a number of safe harbor agenda descriptions, meaning if you agendize it this way, you're good, you're golden, no issue with improperly agendizing an item for closed session. So you've got the public employee discipline, dismissal or release, conference with real property negotiators. In that situation, you have to identify the property, who's the agency negotiator, who are the negotiating parties, and what's under negotiation, price, terms, or both. On slide 61, conference with legal counsel, existing litigation. There was a case that came down recently, Fowler versus City of Lafayette, that basically held that the board agenda packet violated the Brown Act because it didn't provide sufficient information about the case. So you do need to provide the name of the case, and if the case name is unspecified, you have to identify why it's not being specified. Well, when you have this type of issue, it's a good idea to consult with legal counsel. And the other thing about using the conference with legal counsel is technically legal counsel should either be there, or you should be reviewing or receiving perhaps an opinion from legal counsel. So it'd be okay if the superintendent shared a legal opinion provided by counsel. It would be okay under that exception if that were. The other thing that we do sometimes is being available on standby. In case a question arises by the board, a phone call, we'll wait for a phone call if a question arises. Okay. Slide 62. Prior to closed session, the board must disclose in open session the items to be discussed in closed session. So technically, before you convene into closed session, you're supposed to either briefly discuss or say what's going to be discussed in closed session, or you could very simply refer to the items that are listed in the agenda. So you could say the district is, before you go into closed session, the district will be convening into closed session to review the items listed on the agenda identified under closed session. Something as simple as that.
Can you clarify a point for us? Should any item be discussed in closed session that is not listed on the agenda?
No.
Is that appropriate for?
No, it's not appropriate to discuss items in closed session that are not agendized or that do not fall under the agendized item. I will say that, for example, in my opinion, if the agenda has the personnel, the generalized discipline, dismissal, release, if that is part of the agenda, and if the board was going, or the staff were going to discuss with the board the termination of employee A, and sometime between the agenda being posted and the actual meeting occurring, within that 72 hours, there was now an issue with employee B being totally unrelated to employee A. In my opinion, it would be permissible to discuss employee B as well under that agendized item, because it covers anything that would deal with dismissal or release of an employee. You raise a great question, and my advice to clients, trustees, is we all benefit by helping each other, reminding each other about the limitations of the Brown Act, because it's not uncommon, and I've been in closed session meetings regularly, but it's not uncommon for a conversation to go lateral, and you're talking about one topic and then another item that's just very loosely related on the periphery comes up, and as a lawyer, I have to diplomatically remind the board, you're going beyond the agendized item. I have to advise you not to discuss it. But you don't always have a lawyer there in the meetings, and so I think think it's a benefit to all trustees to help each other and to remind each other, of the limitations of the Brown Act. And your superintendent is there as well to assist with that, or whatever other staff is present. But it happens on occasion. It does happen on occasion, and it's a good opportunity just to remind an individual about the limitation.
Scott,
Yes.
this is Kelly. So very often, we will have the superintendent's annual review on the agenda for, several conversations. If there are goals on the superintendent's annual review that relate to an issue that is currently happening, let's say there's a communications issue and that's part of his goal, then we do discuss those things in relation to his annual review. Are we getting into dicey water at that point? I mean, to me, it seems like, okay, here's an issue that's current, and it is related to the superintendent's goals. Let's discuss it in relation to the superintendent's annual review.
It can get dicey. If the intent of the conversation is to focus on that issue or item and how the superintendent handled it or is handling it, consistent or in the context of his evaluation or in areas or goals of which he is being evaluated, then it's likely permissible. But if the intent is to use the evaluation closed session exception to just talk about items carte blanche, then that would not be permissible. So it's an issue that needs to be finely navigated. Because I'm about to get into the enforcement piece of closed session. But anything else on that question?
It's about meeting the intent of the law.
Right.
In addition to.
Right, because the intent of the law is to ensure that the public is part of the process and it's transparent. And there's very limited exceptions where the board is allowed to meet outside of the public's purview, right, in closed session. And one of those being personnel, and within personnel, an evaluation of an employee. And so, I could see the issue arise. I've never observed it here, but I have seen it with other clients where I'm sitting in closed session and a topic comes up and it's loosely related, and that might be okay, but then further dialogue, then it becomes more apparent that we're pushing over, and we're now going outside of the bounds of what was agendized. And that's where I will make a reminder. So it's something that there's no Brown Act police sitting in a meeting, and you're really obligated on your own as trustees and employees of the district that might be in closed session to help each other navigate what can and can't be discussed. And errors occur, it's human nature for an error to occur, but when errors become common practice is when that creates issues which may be subject to sanction as well.
Can you touch just for a moment on what happens in closed session, stays in closed session, and the violations?
Yes, I'm just about to get to that, so that's a good segue.
Go ahead.
Actually, that's my next slide. So 65. So the law is clear that a person may not disclose confidential information that has been acquired by being present in authorized closed session to a person not entitled to receive it. So, board members discuss an item in closed session. The sanctity of closed session it's not permitted to be pierced. There's very limited exceptions. So whatever you learn in closed session stays in closed session. And you know, there's great value to that because, again, the general rule is everything happens in open session, public is a part of it. But the legislature has concluded that in limited exceptions, there should be an opportunity for members of the body or the board to discuss an item of importance to the district, to allow for the free flow of discussion about a very important item. And there has to be this understanding that in that limited exception, the sanctity of that closed session cannot be violated. It has to stay there. The only limited exceptions to that are if perhaps there was some perception or belief, a legitimate belief that perhaps something that was being discussed was inappropriately discussed during closed session, that wasn't within the confines of what was agendized, or something illegal was being discussed, or perhaps you know, there was some business being contemplated or discussed in closed session that triggered some whistleblower obligation. So there's very limited exceptions where the sanctity of closed session can be pierced, and they're defined by law. And the law also is clear that if a person or a trustee or a member of a legislative body that's subject to the Brown Act, if they willfully violate closed session and disclose information willfully, that's an item that's reportable to the grand jury. And then the grand jury can determine what discipline or sanction or legal action should be imposed against that member of the board. So it's a serious thing. My advice to clients is to, whatever's said in closed session stays in closed session. You don't want to risk information being disclosed or being subject to something like that, where there's even an allegation that a trustee willfully violated it, because then that goes to the grand jury. You potentially have the DA, district attorney involved, and those things don't always stay confidential. Those are the kinds of stories that the media just loves to run with. Anytime they can put a public official in negative light, they seem to revel in that. So it's something to be mindful of.
We have had on occasion parents who have wanted to come in and speak to us in closed session over discipline of a child, or teachers who have wanted to speak to us for various reasons. And I think that's one of the catch-22s of closed session, is if they come in and speak to us about something, and then later, whatever they said in closed session is out there for whatever reason, they could turn around and come back and say, well, that came from closed session, when it may have came from them.
Yeah, that's one of the risks of inviting, and the board has discretion to invite someone into closed session. They have that discretion. But it's one of the risks of inviting someone who's outside of the agency into closed session, because you can't necessarily ensure that they're going to maintain the sanctity of closed session. My advice is, if you're going to do that, is to remind them that you are in closed session by law. Anything discussed or discussed in closed session is confidential and may not be shared outside of closed session, but even that is not always enough to keep them from sharing information.
Some people are just looking for a suit.
Right. Okay, slide 66. So there are enforcement remedies, civil remedies such as injunction. In that Paradise case that I shared, the families were able to get an injunction against the school district. Also, violations of the meeting notice and agenda provisions may cause an action to be null and void. Such actions may be commenced by the district attorney or by any interested person. So moving on to slide 67. There is an opportunity to cure and correct So if a violation does occur, and I've had this happen where a client reaches out to me and says, hey, turns out we made a mistake. I said, well, cure and correct. It may not look good for the district, but errors do occur and there is an opportunity to correct it. So cure and correct, basically you're redoing the action, making sure it's properly noticed and agendized, and redoing the action. If that doesn't occur, if the cure and correct doesn't occur, then there's the opportunity for the interested person or the DA to come after the district, come after a district for violating the Brown Act. If an individual does it and they're successful, they can recover attorney's fees. And that's one of the limited exceptions, one of the limited instances where attorney's fees can be recoverable against a public agency. And that can be costly. So if a mistake occurs, my advice is always cure and correct. We don't want to take the risk with some type of litigation and then having to shell out attorney's fees to the filing party. All right, slide 68. Under enforcement, the Brown Act also allows the district attorney or an interested person to file an action regarding past violations. Now, they have to do it within 9 months of the alleged violation, starting with a cease and desist letter. But there is the ability for members of the public out there to also try to enforce the Brown Act for past violations. All right, now slide 69, the Q&A, stump the lawyer.
Stump the lawyer.
Is there any questions that I can try to answer that you might have? I cannot tell you what's in Marie's birthday cake recipe. I have no idea. I can just tell you it's delicious.
No,
Any questions for me?
And I would just say, I appreciate Scott, I like the level of detail too, and I like the examples, because you read the slides and you hear, but then the examples bring it to life, so thank you. I mean, I don't have any questions, I don't know.
Very good presentation.
All good for me? Okay,
Um,
perfect.
Were you around when we had Dana
Nancy, will you
Rivers
speak
thing?
into the mic? Nancy.
At the,
Dana Rivers?
Nancy.
If you were around, you'd know.
I don't remember that.
Our transgender teacher.
Please speak into the microphone, we can't hear you.
Nancy.
Thank you.
If you're gonna speak, Nancy, speak into the microphone. They were having, but that's okay. You don't need to.
I'm sorry, he didn't know what I was talking about anyway, so it's okay. I asked if he was around during the Dana Rivers days. And he didn't know Dana Rivers, so
All right.
I actually had a question concerning that.
Are there any other questions from the board or superintendent? Hearing no further questions, do we have a motion to adjourn? First of all, thank you, Mr. Holbrook. That was a really great presentation. A lot of good information and a lot of good warnings for us on what we're supposed to do. So that was very useful. And then, hearing no other questions, we have a motion to adjourn. Oh, we need, future agenda items, sorry. Strategic planning. We have.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holbrook.
Thanks, Scott.
Great job.
No agenda items? Okay, our regular meeting will be Wednesday, April 21st at 6 p.m. in the district boardroom, room 503, located at Broward Middle School. And now, the chair will hear a motion to adjourn.
I just want to clarify that we will have a virtual option available. The agenda posted this week did not state that. I'm just confirming for April 21st, we will have that option.
Yes, that was the plan, to have the virtual option, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'll motion,
We have a
Kelly.
motion. Thank you, Del Rey. Oh, and we have a second?
I'll
I'll
second.
second.
Thank you, Mr. Bruno. General consent.
Just to clarify.
That was Mrs. Anderson.
Both Ms. Anderson and Dr. Lee seconded, I actually was not the one.
He wins by default.
So Kelly, Dr. Lee and Trustee Anderson, both of them simultaneously, it was not Bruno for the second. So could take your pick from Dr. Lee or Ms. Anderson for the second to adjourn. I think we're all getting tired. I am.
Sorry, Mrs.
That's okay.
Anderson, general consent.
Yep.
Yes.
All right.
Meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, guys.